That was the defense delivering their closing arguments in the George Birch case from yesterday. We'll deliver you the final verdict later today. Again, I'm here with Attorney Jonna Spilbor. And Jonna, you're not going to have to defend or prosecute. We're just going to have a conversation now.
Okay.
Let's break down a little bit about each one of the defense's points. Okay, so Douglas Dietrich had a concealed carry permit, but the handgun was never found.
Right.
What is that? How does that help the defense's case?
So he's trying to take two rather remote dots and correct them. In other words, as I said earlier today, when you're presenting a third-party defense, some other dude did the defense, as we say, you don't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, because you're the defendant, you don't have anything to prove, that that other person actually did it. But you do need to give the jury enough evidence where they will find, at the end of the day, a reasonable doubt that your client did it. So if he's trying to say here, look, there's a weapon, and this person who we think did it had a concealed carry permit, it's a logical leap, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, to assume that his gun was used in connection with it.
And the fact that we can't find it means that he hid it?
And that's the fact that we can't find it means either that he hid it, the prosecution didn't prove its case, which is really what the defense is striving for here, that the prosecution failed at its burden of proof, because we are giving you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, so much other evidence to consider that could implicate another person in this crime.
Okay, that's one point. The next point that might raise reasonable doubt is that Douglas Dietrich's DNA was found on Nicole's underwear and underneath her fingernails, which would indicate a struggle of some kind. But then again, she lived with him. She had a relationship with him. So how important is that?
So it's moderately important, because that's how that evidence is to be presented. Look, she had DNA under her fingernails and elsewhere on her body and her clothing. And yes, the prosecution is going to say they lived together. Of course that's going to happen, but that's for the jury to weigh when it's making its decision. How important is that to the jury? That's for the jury to figure out when they're deliberating this case. Okay,
what about the fact that Dallas Kennedy, the babysitter, said, out of nowhere, Douglas Dietrich said, oh, Nicole hit her head. Why would, if that's true, why would he say that, especially when we know that she suffered blunt force trauma to the head?
Well, but you stated earlier, not every criminal is sophisticated. He could have said something that implicates him, and it's important for the jury to know that he did say that. The fact why he said it really doesn't matter for purposes of presenting a defense. They don't care why he said it. They just want to show the jury that it was said, and isn't that odd? Does that not give him knowledge of a crime that we are claiming he committed?
Okay, but then the flip side of it is a statement, a gun that they can't find, a missing object, maybe a shoe, all that. That's maybe reasonable doubt, but when you have such convincing evidence, I mean, such strong, overwhelming evidence against the defendant here, placing him at the crime, placing him at where her body was found, and just having his story alone being the reason why, explaining this DNA, is that enough for the George Birch?
For a conviction?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to hope not. I mean, look, why? We were having a consensual relationship, and then this guy comes up behind me and ruins everybody's day. So that is consistent with the defense. Doesn't hurt it.
Well, we've been analyzing the prosecution and the defense's closing arguments, but that's not the end of the story, because the prosecution was allowed a rebuttal closing. You see this a lot of times in cases, a way to contradict what the defense said. We're going to play that for you when we come back from this short break. And after we play these closings in their entirety, I will let our viewers stay tuned. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. We're covering the George Birch case out of Wisconsin, a man who was charged with first-degree intentional homicide in connection with the death of 31-year-old Nicole Vanderheiden. Her body was found 3 miles from her home back in May of 2016. She suffered blunt force trauma to the head and strangulation. George Birch, the defendant, his DNA was all over her body, and data from his cell phone pinpoints him to 4 key locations that night, including the crime scene and where her body was ultimately found. The defense did not refute this evidence, but said that George Birch was not the one that did it, that Douglas Dietrich, Nicole's boyfriend, that he is the true killer in this case. What we've been playing for you right now was the prosecution and the defense's closing arguments from yesterday. Now, we do have a verdict in this case, but I am not going to let you know what that is just yet, because after the defense closed with their closing arguments, the prosecution was allowed a rebuttal argument, and they delivered quite the argument. Take a look.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm very glad that we Mr. Sugar chose to end his address to you by telling you that George Birch, his client, was able to come in front of you and fill in all of the gaps, all of the holes in the disjointed, scattered puzzle pieces of confusion that the defense is trying to present to you as some sort of reasonable explanation for why George Birch's DNA is all over Nicole, for why George Birch is the only person that we have evidence of that is at all of the major crime scenes. He filled in the gaps, he plugged in the holes, he prepared a scripted 3-hour direct examination to fill in every gap. And ask yourselves about his demeanor. Assess his credibility. Compare what he did on direct to what he did on cross. And is cross-examination difficult, and is it my role in part to make it difficult? Absolutely. But what else is difficult? Remembering things that didn't happen. Ask yourselves about how scripted and how prepared he looked on that direct examination. They took 2 hours to walk you through an inane recitation of going to McDonald's on the way home from Chicago, to try to build up for you this man of great character who went to church and came from a great community just like yours. A community where you don't tell the police anything or you'll get killed. A community he fled and left behind his wife and his children, this wonderful family man, this terrific dad who absconds probation in Virginia and flees to Wisconsin, away from his kids, away from the wife to whom he's still married. Such a wonderful father. That's fantastic. He filled in the holes with gibberish, with an utter absurdity of a tale. And all of the information about Doug Dietrich, all of it that they want to throw at you, is utterly irrelevant unless you believe his story. Because his story is the only thing that connects Doug to this crime. The only thing. They accuse the state of ignoring Doug Dietrich and saying that we didn't acknowledge that Doug Dietrich was an aspect that we needed to address. We spent 3 days worth of testimony on Doug Dietrich. We called Doug Dietrich. We called his friends. We called the officers who dealt with the initial part of the investigation. The state presented that evidence to you. We didn't hide from it. We didn't ignore it. You heard that he was arrested. You heard that he was investigated. You heard that the evidence excluded him. They want you to look at speculation and conjecture in all of the things that lead to the wrongful convictions that Mr. Sugar mentioned in his closing statement. Look at the story he told you. The story he told you is exactly what the state did in this case. Do we believe that Doug was involved at the beginning of the case? Yes, absolutely. Detective Slinger arrested him. And then he did exactly what Mr. Sugar implored that you do. We continued to investigate every aspect of this case. We didn't find surveillance video, but we found the next best thing. We found George Birch's DNA on Nicole's sock and no reasonable explanation for it to be there. There's no connection between these two people. And then we went on to find 16 different spots on her body where George Birch's DNA is present and Doug Dietrich's DNA is excluded. And absolutely listen to what Kevin Scott told you about DNA and how it's transferred. It's transferred generally with sustained contact. With consistent contact with a particular area, it's more likely to transfer under those circumstances. You saw Nicole's body. You saw those pictures. You know about the injuries. You know how brutal this attack was. She was strangled. She was beaten. There was persistent, consistent contact with her body. And none of Doug's DNA transferred to those areas? That doesn't make any sense. That's not reasonable. That's not logical. It's inconsistent with the truth. George Birch's DNA transferred to those areas because he's the one who had all that contact with her. And how does he explain it? By creating an utter fallacy, a fantasy,
Okay, the prosecution is making a very strong argument here. Again, I'm here with Jonna Spilbor. You can't deny what he's saying, that George Birch's DNA was present on 16 spots of her body. Right. Douglas Dietrich, who, if you want to believe George Birch, strangled her, killed her, hit her over the head, strangled her, his DNA would be on her in those key locations, and it wasn't.
Right, but don't forget the defense theory of that is, well, of course his DNA is all over her. They were intimate in the back of his car. So, and remember, the jury's job at the end of the day, of course, you want to get to a verdict one way or the other, but the defense strategy here is clearly, let me give you enough evidence that you can look at so that you will find the prosecution has not met its burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
Wasn't it a good idea on the part of the state to bring Dietrich out first and not have the defense call him out? Look, we're putting this in front of you. We know what they're going to say. He was arrested, but he was ruled out. And
that's a very common strategy. When you screw up, for lack of a better word, whether you're a prosecutor or a defense attorney, you try to trot that out get ahead of it so that the jury doesn't have to find out from the other side, so you don't look like you've got something to hide. So was it smart in that case? Yes. But it still makes the jury rethink about why did they go after Dietrich first? Why did they arrest him first? There has to be a reason. And then they look at the evidence that the defense is presenting and they say, maybe he did either do it or have something to do with it.
Jonna, in your experience, okay, let's break this down. If a juror believes George Birch, and all you need is one, so he's not convicted, if it believes his story, have you seen people, have you seen jurors, have you seen polls where a jury can come back with a not guilty verdict or even a mistrial purely based upon the story presented by a defendant on the stand, because they can argue back and forth about forensic evidence attaching George Birch or Douglas Dietrich. But have you seen it really just based upon a defendant taking the stand?
I think those scenarios are rare, especially now because we live in an age where jurors love forensic evidence. They love DNA. They're all fans of CSI. And they know that forensic evidence tends to be very reliable. But here, they have a bit of a conundrum, the jury, because we have a defendant. It would be one thing if George Birch was saying, I don't know this person. I was nowhere near the scene of this crime. And then his DNA is all over her. It's a slam dunk. But to say, yes, I was there, and this guy victimized both of us. I just happened to live through it. That gives the jury pause.
Well, that's what we're going to have to see. Did the jury have pause? I will announce the verdict on air in the George Birch case a little bit later in the program. But what I want to do right now is continue on with the prosecution's rebuttal argument. Take a look.
Until he takes this stand after hearing all of the evidence presented to you over the course of 8 days, he needs an explanation. Just like he needed an explanation for why he didn't call. I didn't call because I'm on probation, I was absconding, or you don't tell people where I'm from. You don't call because you're guilty, and you know you're going to be found guilty. If he really didn't do this, whose DNA would he have suspected would have been on that body? The killer. You'd alert them right away. Let the authorities get out there and find the DNA of the person who did this. Find that murder weapon. Look at that scene. Find all your evidence. He would have come forward right away and allowed police to investigate this and exonerate them. He has shown up at their door with the bloody clothes and said, look, take these. The person who killed this woman had to have touched them, and here's where her body is. Go find your evidence. He didn't do any of that. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't tell his father figure, Ed Jackson. He didn't tell his girlfriend, Jordan Schuyler. He didn't tell the other two gentlemen that he lived with. He certainly didn't tell the police. Not even an anonymous call. Not even an anonymous tip. Go find this body. She might even be alive. Mr. Sugar talked to you about this tragic event that he went through. That it was a tragedy. It was a traumatic event. If you believe Mr. Birch's story, he was assaulted, hit in the head so hard that he was knocked out for God knows how long. Despite being knocked out, he has a specific, particular step-by-step, blow-by-blow explanation of everything that he did. Why? Because it's crafted to explain the evidence in the case. Not because he remembers it. Think about how disorienting that would be. Struck in the head to the point where you are knocked out cold. But then he immediately woke up and he's very apparent. He knows his surroundings, right? I know where Doug is. I know exactly how many feet he is behind me. You see him in the rearview mirror with the dome light that came on that didn't work on cross-examination. Of course, the dome light works on direct, but it doesn't work on cross because it was inconsistent, right? Just like when the defense presents their case, the lighting is perfect. It's wonderful. Doug can see outside and immediately is going to make out that that's his girlfriend in the car with George. But then when we asked Mr. Birch about why he didn't see Doug, well, it's a dark area. It's a dark area over there. You can't see very well. Right? So George couldn't see Doug from 15 feet away. But Doug's off to the right, 120 feet away inside his house, not even able to access the windows. But he's going to be able to see that George Birch is in the car having sex with Nikki. How's he even going to tell that's Nikki? And I love their presentation of Doug, but figure out, what's your argument? Is he the drunk, stupid guy at the bar? Or is he a cold, calculating killer? He isn't both. He can't be both. They're giving you pieces to a puzzle, like they said in their opening. The problem is they aren't the same puzzle. They're giving you pieces to 10 different irrelevant puzzles and asking you to throw them together and find a reasonable outcome. That's not what happened here. Doug was drunk that night. There's no question about it. You had testimony from everybody who was with him at the bar. Doug had been drinking. Doug had been doing a lot of shots. The guy that the defense dragged in to give you testimony, Max, he told you, yeah, I thought I was going to get left at the bar with drunk Doug because he's sitting at the bar having another drink. If Doug didn't seem to care about Nikki that night and seemed to find her, then why is he suddenly so pissed off, as the defense said in their opening statement, when he finds her? If he was guilty of anything, it was guilty of not caring enough. When did he flip this switch into this?
He was guilty. He's guilty of not caring enough. Jonna really saying the fact that if Douglas Dietrich did anything, it was being a bad boyfriend. But you can't deny what he's saying here. The point I think the jury is going to probably have a problem with is he never reported this. George Birch never reported this. He came home, took a shower, washed his clothes, didn't even do an anonymous phone call. Mm-hmm. Somebody who is guilty would do what he did.
Well, or somebody who's on probation would do what he did. He wasn't even supposed to be in the state, which is part of his defense. Like he was truly, if you believe him, he was truly afraid of the ancillary consequences to him if he got involved. Something horrible happened. He's trying to save himself. That explains that piece of evidence.
Jonna, and I guarantee you jurors will be thinking about that, about whether or not he was afraid to report to the police or tell anybody about what happened because he was on probation. He didn't want to get involved in this mess. That's what they're going to have to decide. And we know that their verdict was delivered last night. I will make sure to announce it on the air a little bit later in the program. When we come back, we're going to continue on with the prosecution's rebuttal argument. We'll take a quick break. We'll be back in a minute. Hey everybody, welcome back to Law and Crime Live. We're covering the George Birch case out of Wisconsin. Now, even though we do have a verdict, but I will not announce it yet. I will announce it later on in the program. What we are doing right now is recapping the case. That's what we're doing. And what you might not have seen yesterday was the closing arguments from the state and the defense. Well, earlier today, we've played you the closing arguments by the prosecution and the defense. But now what I am playing for you right now is the prosecution's rebuttal closing arguments. After the defense argued their case, here's what the prosecution had to say. And you can really hear them carefully, just biting into and really going after George Birch's story and saying how ridiculous it is. Take a look.
Rageful, jealous boyfriend that they presented to you in opening. Go back to that opening. That opening isn't evidence. That opening is their map, their roadmap. Ask yourselves, check the box. What from that roadmap that they gave you did they actually demonstrate? Where did they show Doug being angry? Where did they show a fight at the watering hole? Who told you about a fight at the watering hole? No one. Everyone told you that they got along fine at the watering hole. And Doug never even saw Nikki after the watering hole. They were never together. The only person who ever suggests that the two of them were together after the watering hole is that guy right there. the guy with the single most incentive to lie to you about what happened in this case. The only guy who had criminal convictions on the record, as you consider for his credibility. That's the only guy who says that they're ever together after the watering hole. And yeah, you saw Nikki's text messages. They were upset. She was upset at Doug. You also saw Doug's responses. LOL, Nikki, knock it off. Call me, please. Right? And that's after Nikki sends a slew of text messages. And Doug sends a few in response. And they're calm. Dallas Kennedy, who it's pretty clear everyone saw Dallas, she didn't want to be here, she didn't want to be testifying in court on this case. She said that Doug looked like he was trying to calm Nikki down. He was calm that night. He was drunk. If anything, he wasn't very attentive, that's for sure. When did he flip into this jealous, rageful, horrible individual? When did he turn into a calculated killer who took great lengths to cover up his crime? Cover up his crime? He left the flippin' murder weapon outside in front of his house for 2 days. Are you kidding me? There's no way that Doug was a calculated killer covering up his crime. All this stuff with the car, that's a red herring. That's way off in left field. You got the information from Progressive. That car didn't move. You had testimony from Don Chick, who's going to say, oh, I saw this car in the driveway with a blonde woman. Okay, maybe it was Friday, Don, when Nikki was out in her own car. Nikki's a blonde woman. It was noon. She went to get gas. She went out and did rummage sailing. Dallas told you that. Maybe his day was wrong. We know that car didn't move. And even if it moved, so what? It moved to do what? To cover up this crime? He would cover up the crime, but leave the murder scene and leave the murder weapon in front of his house for 2 days? Police didn't find it until May 23rd. That's not a cold, calculated killer. It makes no sense. It's utterly irrational. It's unreasonable. And they want you to believe that Doug would have hid this body in Hoffman Road because it's an area that he knows well. That the only way that someone would end up there is if they know where that field is. You're all citizens of Brown County. You saw the maps. Ask yourself about that location. You turn right out of the subdivision. You don't take the first left because that's the area it just came from, and you know that there's a school there and businesses there and it's well lit. You go to the next left. What do you see? What do you see all your way down GV? You see open field on the left. Open field. What am I going to do? I got to get rid of this body. I'm going to turn left the first chance I get. Where's the first chance you can turn left? Hoffman Road. And you're speeding. You're going faster, right? Okay, that's a 6-minute drive. Assuming the speed limit, he's got a dead body in his car. He's probably going a little faster than the speed limit. I need to find a place to get rid of this body. I turn left. And I go up Hoffman Road. And what do I see? Sheriff's office on the right. Better not stop there. Hotel on the left. I keep going straight. What do I wait until? First clearing where I see some trees, and then there's no houses on the right. That's where we are on Hoffman Road. That's where he turned in. That's where he dumped the body. And ask yourself about that location data. He's the one who's there. He's the one who's 9 feet away from that dump site. 9 feet away where he admits he's the one who brutally brought Nikki to her end and says he threw her over and took off running, right? Took off running and went so darn fast that he traveled 82 feet in 15 seconds. After he's the one who testified that he turned the damn car around already. So the car was turned around and headed out, and he's in such a rush to get away from Doug that he goes 82 feet in 15 seconds? What's he really doing? Probably plugging in the GPS on the way home. How do I get out of here? Just dump this body. I gotta get home. Doug Dietrich wouldn't bring a body to the middle of town, half a mile from the family restaurant where he goes with his family to have dinner, in the middle of a subdivision half a mile up the way. Doug Dietrich, this calculated killer that they want to tell you about, who so carefully cleans up the next day, but he didn't just take a left out of the subdivision and go off into rural Rockland. And Doug Dietrich, this calculated killer, this angry, vicious boyfriend, kills Nikki, and she's laying there dead. And according to his story, Doug's just patiently waiting for George to wake up. Hey, man, Can you help me move this body? How ridiculous is that? If Doug is this angry, rageful, jealous boyfriend, he doesn't even hit him. George is out cold on the ground, and you saw what was done to Nicole. That's brutal. So if you believe that Doug did that to Nicole, he left George Birch utterly unharmed? It's absurd. He would have been just as pissed as the guy who's having sex with his girlfriend. He'd have gone right after George, too. He sure as hell wouldn't have enlisted a complete stranger to help him move a body and then let him get away. It's nonsense. It is fiction. It's not even fiction. It's fiction makes sense. You would reject this as fiction. And there's holes. You want to hear about holes in a story? There's a hole in Mr. Birch's story. How did those clothes get so darn bloody on the outside? Where did that blood come from? Every item of clothing is blood soaked. That's how Nicole's pants were found on the roadside. They're inside out. There is blood in the crotch area of those underwear. What is that from? That's from his forcible sexual assault. He admits he's the one who penetrated her. And she has all these internal injuries. Blood in her vaginal wall. Blood on the inside of her underwear. Her pants are inside out. If her pants are inside out, how did the outside of those pants get all that blood, all that hair, all that dirt, if they're off in his consensual fantasy encounter that he had in the back of that car? Because that's what he told you. Her pants were off, her legs were off, we were having a great time. No, that's disgusting. It's harmful to her reputation. It's offensive, and it's untrue. That's not what happened. What happened is he forced himself on her, and she struggled. And it hurt, and it caused her to bleed, and that blood from the inside of her underwear is a result of those injuries that he inflicted. And then when he killed her, and he dragged her along the street, and he dragged her through the field, she got blood and dirt and hair on the outside of her pants, and they're filthy. Because they were on her when she was assaulted. Just like her shirt was. Just like her tank top was. It's not this sexual fantasy that this man has. She struggled, she resisted, he punished her for it. And the evidence tells you that. We absolutely bear the burden in this case. We bear the burden of proving this case to you beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt. What is a reasonable doubt? It's based on reason and common sense, arising from a fair and rational consideration of the evidence, or lack of evidence. It is a doubt that would cause a person of ordinary prudence, which is you. You are an ordinary, reasonable person. It's not based on guesswork or speculation. It's not based on the fear that you'll get it wrong that Mr. Sugar wanted to tell you about. Maybe you wrongfully convict someone. It's not based on fear or speculation. It's based on evidence. You are not to search for doubt. You are to search for the truth. The only reasonable explanation, the only truth in this case, is that George Birch killed Nicole Manor. He is at all four of the crime scenes in this case. He picked her up and brought her home from the bar. He brought her in front of the home on Berkeley where she was killed. He brought her to her final resting place in the field on Hoffman Road, and he dumped her clothes on 172. Half of that, 3/4 of it, he admits to. And as long as we're talking about standard detective techniques, it's standard detective technique, it's standard interview practice, that if a person admits to all key events except the one thing that implicates them, that's what they're hiding. They're only hiding the truth as to what happened. He admits to everything else. He admits to picking her up at the bar. He admits to wanting to have sex with her. He admits to bringing her home to Berkeley Road where they did have sex. He admits to penetrating her. He admits essentially that he caused those injuries, although he'll say it's the result of consensual activity. He admits to hauling and dumping her body and dumping her clothes. The only thing he's not going to admit to is whatever happened when he was knocked out cold. 6'7", 260-pound George Birch, knocked out cold by something that didn't even create a mark in his head, right? Well, it was sore, but it wasn't a mark. Why wasn't it a mark? Because the people would have seen it. He has an explanation for everything. Well, not everything. Not a reasonable explanation. He has an explanation. Don't let him use that excuse to get out of what he did. Follow the path. Follow the evidence that's been presented to you in this case. That path leads to one place. His own, his guilt. That is the man that killed Nicole Vanderheiden. The man that met this woman in a bar and admitted by his own account to dumping her body in that field looks like this the next day. Who does that? Who looks like this the next day? Somebody capable of doing this. This is a planned trip, so hey, I know, sure, my version is I was assaulted in the back of the head and made to do this horrible, traumatic thing, which Mr. Sugar told you. This was the most traumatic day of his life. Sure looks like it. This is him the next day, not calling the police, not telling anybody about it. That's him the next day. There is no way his story is true, and you know it. Follow the evidence. It will lead you down the path of truth. The evidence leads you to the path of truth, and so does his story. It leads you to the very same place, his guilt. And that's why we're asking that you return a verdict of guilty for first-degree intentional homicide for George Birch. Bring justice to Nikki and her family.
Follow the path, follow the evidence. It leads to his guilt. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was the entire case. That was the prosecution's rebuttal closing argument. So you have seen now everything in this case. Everything. Jonna Spilbor. When we come back, I am going to announce the verdict on the air. But before we do that, you can't deny that fishing picture. That fishing picture was huge just there. That's the last image that was in the minds of the jurors.
There are a lot of pieces of evidence that cannot be denied here. And I have to tell you, not that the jury ever decides a case based solely on closing arguments, but the prosecution did a really good job.
They did a great job.
They sewed it up really nicely, and so it is what it is.
As good as they did, though, the defense put on a very, at least plausible, alternative theory about what might have happened here. And Douglas Dietrich, he seemed to have a lot more questions about him than answers. Was it enough to convince at least one juror that George Birch should not be found guilty? I'm going to let you know when we come back from this short break. We'll play you the verdict in its entirety. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. So, you've heard all the different parts of the George Birch case. That's what we've played for you today. We played you the closing arguments by both the state and the defense. Now, again, George Birch was on trial for first-degree intentional homicide in connection with the death of 31-year-old Nicole Vanderheiden. Despite overwhelming evidence against him, including the fact that his DNA was all over her body, despite the fact that data from his cell phone indicates that he was in 4 key locations that night, including the crime scene and where her body was found, the defense said he didn't do it, that it was Douglas Dietrich. That George had met Nicole that night at a bar, had sex with her, when he was hit over the head, knocked unconscious by Douglas Dietrich. And while he was unconscious, Douglas Dietrich was the one that killed Nicole. When George came to, he was held at gunpoint by Douglas and forced to dispose of Nicole's body. Now, we heard all of this. We heard all of the evidence. We heard all the arguments. Last night, the verdict was delivered by the jury. We have that for you right now. Take a look.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we've been advised that you've reached a verdict. Is that correct? Then if you would pass the verdict forms over to the bailiff. State of Wisconsin versus George Stephen Birch, Brown County case 16 CF 1309. The verdict reads as follows. We, the jury, find the defendant, George Stephen Birch, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, is charged in the information. It is signed by our foreperson and dated this first day of March, 2018. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is this your verdict?
Yes.
They are saying yes and shaking their heads. Does either party wish to have the jury polled?
Yes, Judge.
All right. There's a right to have the jury polled at this time, and this is how it will work. The juror right to the left of the bailiff. If that is your verdict, just you may say, yes, this is my verdict. If not, you can answer, no, this is not my verdict, and we'll just go down the row and around. So, is this your verdict?
Yes.
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 Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I have one last instruction to read to you. Your service in this case is completed. And on behalf of the court, our court staff, and the citizens of Brown County, we greatly appreciate your service and the personal sacrifice that you've made in fulfilling your duties as responsible citizens. You have been a very attentive and patient jury. We thank you for your service. We hope that you will look back on this experience as a very positive one. You do not have to answer any questions about this case now from anyone other than the court. There is no requirement that you maintain secrecy concerning what happened in the jury room, but you do not have to discuss this case with anyone or answer any questions about it. If you care to do so, you may. It is your decision. Once again, thank you. Have a good evening, and you are excused.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. George Birch was found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide in connection with the death of Nicole Vanderheiden. And as you just saw, you saw all of the family, the friends of Nicole really weeping at this result. And you even saw the reaction of Douglas Dietrich, who some people could say he's relieved. But that's an interesting sign right there. We've heard comments both ways. Some people say, wow, this is relief of somebody that loved Nicole. Some people say, wait a minute, maybe this guy did hide something and he feels a little bit relieved. Let's analyze everything about this case and the verdict. Again, I'm here with Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, first reaction, were you surprised at the verdict?
Not even a little bit. However, here's what I did think. I thought there was enough defense evidence put forth that they may have ended up with a hung jury, that one person out of that jury box might have said, I'm not so wholly convinced that it was this defendant. But they took 3 hours. They came back with a guilty verdict. Certainly, Jesse, the evidence supports a guilty verdict, so I'm not surprised.
We've analyzed this case on Law and Crime and also on lawandcrime.com. We have some articles about it, but it should also be noted that some of the jurors spoke out to the media afterwards. And one of the things that really stuck with them is the cord. So again, we know that the cord had George Birch's DNA on it, and it also had Nicole Vanderheiden's DNA on it. It was found outside of the home. It raises the question, if somebody killed her, if Douglas Dietrich had killed her, why would you leave it right outside? But what they really stuck upon the fact was that that cord did not match the cords that were found in Douglas Dietrich's garage. That was a sticking point for them.
Yeah, so they associated the murder weapon with the defendant here in this case, and that might have been the thing. I mean, we've talked about this before too. You know what happens when the jury goes back to deliberate. In this case, it took 3 hours. Typically what they do is they start with a vote to see where everybody is, and then if everybody's not on the same page, they go back through the key pieces of evidence to determine, what it is, what do you need to hear in order to be persuaded to go along with the rest of us, essentially. And it would not surprise me if a couple of jurors on that in that jury box didn't originally start out as guilty. Would not surprise me.
Well, I think the prosecution did a superb job. And I think that rebuttal closing argument, which we played in its entirety here on the network, was so powerful. Use your common sense. Here's a man who runs away from a scene. He sees a woman murdered. He's asked to remove her, dispose of her body. He goes home. He showers. He changes his clothes. He doesn't tell his friends. He doesn't tell the police. He goes on a fishing trip the next day and takes a picture as if nothing happened. What's more plausible? A killer, a cold-blooded killer who doesn't have any empathy and would do that? Or somebody who's a victim? I don't think a victim, an innocent party, would look that innocent afterwards.
And that's another thing. We often call upon 12 strangers to determine what a guilty person would do or a not guilty person would do, and that to me is never compelling. Well, it is common sense, and that's what they're asking the jury to do. To me, it's not. We don't know. We don't know. Like, right? You and I have never murdered anybody. We don't know what a murderer does after they murder someone. Thank God, and we never will. So that's a little neither here nor there. But I do think the prosecution did a good job. It begs a question, though. I mean, the defense did raise a few holes. I mean, that was sort of the theme of their closing argument. There are some holes that the prosecution didn't fill.
But they couldn't have raised those holes unless George Birch testified, right? In other words, there wasn't enough evidence besides his story to say that he didn't do it and Douglas Dietrich do it. They had to have him testify. They can't regret that decision, right?
They might regret that decision because, remember, defendants never have to testify. Obviously, we know that. But in this case, I am curious as to why. Like earlier we talked about, well, maybe they were trying to humanize him, right? Make him not seem like such a monster. And that is one good reason to have somebody testify. But when you're going for the defense of the prosecution is not going to meet their burden of proof, sometimes it's better to just sit back and not have your client testify, because if the burden's not met, then the burden's not met. Don't allow the jury to fill in holes that the prosecution has left.
We've seen cases before where they don't point the finger at another suspect. They just poke holes in the evidence put forward by the prosecution. But they couldn't fight off his DNA being on her. They couldn't fight off the cell phone evidence showing that he was, A, where she was ultimately murdered, B, where her body was disposed of, C, in the bar location where he first met her, and D, where the clothing was found. I remember her clothing, her purse was found on the outside of the highway. If he can't fight that, the only thing he had to do was take the stand and present some sort of story. He
might not have had to take the stand. I'm still on the fence about that. But he did have to present somebody else did it, and that put me there. And I could just imagine his attorneys interviewing him for the first time, having a consultation with him, going through a police report and asking him, well, this has you at every single point of the crime. It has you with her, it has you in the field, it has you here, it has you there. What say you, client?
Right.
And he would have to say, I was there, I just didn't do it. Okay, now let's build the case from there. I'm confident that that's how it started.
It seems like a classic example of building a story based upon the evidence against you. You know, he said he was knocked unconscious. Big guy, huge guy, has no bruise on the back of his head. Right. How are you knocked unconscious, A, and B, knocked unconscious for such a long period of time that a murder happens, and there's nothing to show for it?
It does seem odd. I like the way they wrapped that up in the closing argument, the prosecution. Like, it doesn't make sense. What, the killer was just waiting there for this big dude to wake up after he knocked him out and help him get rid of the body? That did not make sense. But then again, playing devil's advocate, what was the motive for George Birch to commit this murder? Why did he kill somebody who he just met, who he was having sex, or not having sex with, raping, if you believe the prosecution?
John, I agree with you. The motive for Douglas to commit the murder, clear cut. You always look at the boyfriend, you always look at the husband.
Oh, yeah.
You look at somebody, the significant other.
As a relationship.
They have something to gain by this. But, as the prosecution said at the beginning of this case, random acts of violence happen, and maybe he was upset that she pushed off his advances in the car. Who knows? The problem is, Jonna, we'll never really know the whole story about what happened to that beautiful 31-year-old mother, Nicole Vanderheiden.
That poor baby is going to grow up without her. And yeah, although this will be appealed, he will appeal this, whatever his sentence is, I'm sure. And I think the Fitbit evidence and the other evidence, the electronic evidence, is going to be front and center.
And that's really what brought this case front and center, was that Fitbit evidence. Jonna Spilbor, thank you so much for joining us on this case this morning.
Always a pleasure, Jesse. Thank you.
It was great to have you.
Thank you.
And as Jonna said, that Fitbit evidence, that was the key part in this case. It's really legal precedent there, putting that into evidence, as well as the story of all these characters. And as we always say, we hope that some justice could be brought to Nicole Vanderheiden's family. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day. We'll see you soon.